All right, and then I'm going to start recording my own audio also. Okay. Sweet, and then let me know when you're recording yours.
Okay, yeah, I'm recording my audio now.
Okay, awesome. Well, Mouthy Infidel, thanks a lot for coming on. I mean, I didn't have specific things in mind that I wanted to talk to you, but I was just curious. I mean, on our podcast, which I don't know how much you know about it, but like, we're a bunch of PhD students, or actually two of us have our PhDs, and then two of us are still working on our PhDs, and we're mostly studying various forms of philosophy. I don't know how much. I mean, you seem to be pretty good at arguing, at least, but I don't know how much like actual philosophy reading you've done. But yeah, don't worry, not expecting us to go too much into the weeds. But the reason I mentioned that is because there's like two schools of thought in philosophy. I don't know if you're familiar with like continental versus analytic philosophy.
Yeah,
And like
I'm passingly familiar with the distinction. Yeah.
passingly familiar. Yeah, obviously, I think continental philosophy gets disparaged a lot for being unclear and like full of kind of French and German elitism or something, and impenetrable language. I've been persuaded that I think there's a lot of value in both traditions. But in any case, we do tend to do mostly continental, except the two political members of the podcast, me and Matt McManus. We both dabble a little bit more into analytic philosophy as well. But yeah, so we've done some episodes on like, I guess what people pejoratively call like debate bros or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
I think we had Ben Burgess on to talk about that a little bit, but I thought it would be interesting to actually talk to somebody who does do a lot of debates. And, I think sometimes like people in academia like think it's weird that I love watching these debates so much. I don't know. Like I sometimes think that there's like a bit of a, I don't want to say like snobbishness exactly, but I think some people get a little bit, they're like, why are you spending time watching these like debates that go nowhere? And I think the way sometimes I've explained it before in the past is, some people like to watch like Marvel movies, some people like to do like whatever, watch
Yeah.
reality TV shows, and like I like to spend my time watching these like really combative debates. But
Yeah. Well, there's also so you're familiar with the debate that Richard Wolff had with Destiny, right?
oh yeah.
Um, and there was a interview that the Serfs did with Richard Wolff after that, which I really like something that Richard Wolff said, where so the Serfs kind of brought up this point of like people were saying like, oh, why would you even degrade Richard Wolff by putting him on this platform with a debate bro or whatever? And Richard Wolff said, if socialist ideas are just restricted to academia, then like our movement's never going to get anywhere, right? So I think in a lot of ways the kind of like snobbishness that you're talking about can be pretty counterproductive.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that it's a way of disseminating the ideas, but I guess the worry is that most people watching the debate, and I'm sure this is true, right, are like very stuck to their specific ideological position. They're probably not going to be, but I know Destiny sometimes himself argues that there's like a 20%, which might be, in my opinion, a bit optimistic. I think it's
Yeah,
probably less than that.
probably, yeah.
That like are willing to be turned. But I was hoping we could start. I'm curious, just like what got you into doing debating and making YouTube videos. Like, how did that all start for you? Like, what was kind of the trajectory?
Yeah, so it's funny because I've actually been making YouTube videos about politics since I was like 12. When I was like really, really young, I started reading Failed States by Noam Chomsky. That was the first thing that I ever read, like politically, and that was really interesting to me. So I kind of just went down the political rabbit hole very, very young. And so I did YouTube videos for a while, but there really wasn't a market for it at the time, and nothing ever really happened with it. Um, and then I just kind of resigned to making essays and arguing with people on like, niche social media platforms.
Right.
But then once there started to be a sort of resurgence of like, okay, people are actually interested in listening to people make videos and talk about politics, I started doing that. And I guess for me, debating is more just, it's not really a specific thing that I like to do. It's just more of it's just one of the ways that I can express ideas and engage with like different arguments. And that's really what I'm interested in. I just like, I guess I do it for one, because I want to spread certain arguments that I find compelling, because I want people to be more able to ground their positions, or I want to challenge the positions of people who disagree with me. And then also there's a sort of self-serving aspect as well, where I kind of want to make I want to be as sure as possible that I'm not kind of like echo chambering myself into believing ideas that are wrong. And so I think that engaging with other people's arguments is a good way of sort of, checking against that.
Right. So it's almost like a vehicle for you to just explore those ideas in a little bit more
Mhm.
detail, right? And
Yeah, exactly.
you know, and when you were initially on some of those other like fringe social media platforms, like what were those ones that you were like? It was like kind of just on comment boards, just back and forth, and then it kind of evolved from there, where you would invite people to be like, well, let's get on and make a video about it, or is that how it started? Or
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, I would argue with people in like comment sections and like threads on Reddit and on Instagram and stuff like that. At one point, I started like uploading like short essays about politics on Instagram, and sometimes I would like debate people over like Instagram Live.
oh
And
wow,
eventually, I decided to just do a YouTube channel about it.
interesting. You said you started by getting an interested in politics from reading that Chomsky book,
Mhm.
and I'm curious, at that time, like before you read that, did you have some kind of like political predispositions, or like did you think about politics much? And like just tell me a little bit about that.
I was very, before that, I was sort of very just passingly familiar with political issues. I would occasionally like watch videos on YouTube of like, Jon Stewart or like, Bill O'Reilly or Crossfire with Tucker Carlson and that other guy whose name I don't remember.
Right.
So I would sort of like watch some political stuff, but I didn't really have like strong opinions on it. It was more so just like an entertainment thing. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
sort of like reading Chomsky was the first thing that sort of pushed me to actually start to dive deeper into it and like try and ground my positions, I guess.
Yeah, that's cool. I think I had a similar experience. I remember watching Jon Stewart, and I think I'm in Canada, and I'm probably quite a bit older than you. I'm not sure actually how old you are, but I remember there was a time when Fox News wasn't available in Canada at all, but I would like hear about it, and I remember we got it we like when digital cable was becoming a bit of a new thing, like back in the early 2000s, and I was pretty young, and I remember we subscribed, we had Fox News, and I remember just being so fascinated by the level of like of sensationalist rhetoric that was going
Right,
on there.
right.
Like it was
Yeah.
almost just it was weird. I like so disagreed, but I couldn't take my eyes away from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you've had that experience too. Like I
Oh,
like
100%. Yeah, definitely. That was
I
that was
wonder.
sort of my experience for a really long time. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if that's like it seems like most people aren't actually that interested in exposing their views to scrutiny, and like I think most people find it quite unpleasant to watch things like that they adamantly disagree with, and it seems to be like a weird quirk of some random chance that you and I maybe have this disposition where we derive some pleasure from it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of people who like um insofar as they watch content where their ideas are being engaged, it's kind of more just a hate watch thing. Um like a lot of people will come to my debates that I'll do with, name of various odious right-wing figure, and they'll just be like, oh, this kid needs to cut his hair or some like it's very clear that there's not like a actual motivation to be intellectually challenged, which is, I guess, a bit disappointing. But I mean, it is how it is.
Yeah, that is disappointing, and actually that makes me think something else that occurred to me earlier when you were talking about the value of debating as a vehicle for testing your ideas. And I did have a browse through like a lot of the debates you've done, and I think how I guess I was curious, how often have you actually been satisfied by your debate partners where they actually tested your ideas in a meaningful way?
So I unfortunately I can't name that many examples. I guess I did a recent debate with Euron Brook, and I thought that was interesting because it gave me sort of more of an insight into like, I guess, Randian thinking, and where like my sort of moral predisposition would conflict with that. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's less common than I would have hoped. Where
Yeah, I mean, would
yeah.
you not say that the majority of people that you end up engaging with are like potentially bad faith? Like, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, specifically, so I feel like a lot of the libertarians who I've debated, so like I debated a Dutch politician who's a libertarian, and I debated Euron Brook, A lot of the libertarians I've debated seem to engage in good faith.
Mhm.
I think when you get into the territory where it's like, more like Trump type alt-right figures, that's where I sort of run into people who are less interested in making arguments and more interested in being like, oh, you're autistic or you're gay or, yeah, that kind of
Yeah.
territory.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. In fact, I think I discovered you because I saw that you did that debate with Destiny, like the tag team one or whatever.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
what stood out to me about that was, and I wonder if you'll agree with this, but I think Destiny has a bad reputation for some good reasons. Like I find that he goes a little bit too far, and it seems like his rhetoric is like, I think he can just be straight up mean sometimes, like unnecessarily, I would
yeah,
say. Um, but I think that the core of the views that he has, I often find myself agreeing with them. Not always, but like I would say the majority of the time I do. Um, but it almost seemed like you were presenting like arguments in a way, like I feel like you don't have the meanness, I guess, that
yeah,
Destiny has, but I feel like you offer compelling arguments. Like I think Destiny's usually good faith, but he sometimes like gets, I don't know how to put it, like just too caught up in like trying to own or like catch the other
mm.
person, and like I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think that so that's a big problem for, I think, debate culture in general. Um, and I think in part it's because people criticize me for defending Destiny too much, but I genuinely think that Destiny was sort of the epicenter that debate culture kind of originated out of. And I think that there are certain things about Destiny that a lot of people who liked Destiny even sort of grew these misconceptions and then tried to replicate them, and then it became problematic. So like what you mentioned with like a Destiny being like really focused on like gotchas and stuff, I think that can sometimes be true, but I think that Destiny generally engages in pretty good faith with regards to I think he's genuinely like, when I've heard people make arguments that he can't refute, he will like shift his position, right? He's not somebody who I don't think is like, or who I think is like refusing to actually engage intellectually. Um, but I do think that he can be a bit over inflammatory and over aggressive sometimes. I think that's just kind of how he is.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that did have some utility, I guess, because when Destiny kind of rose to prominence, it was the era of like, people like Sargon of Akkad and these sort of super aggressive alt-right figures who kind of built this reputation around, I'm a manly right-winger intellectual and none of the lib cucks will debate me because they're too afraid. And so I think there might be some value in having people who are challenging ideas in a sort of aggressive kind of way like that. But that's not
Yeah.
personally how I like to approach it. It's just not, I just can't really approach it in that way. Like I'm just not interested in having sort of screaming matches, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I have to say I agree with you. Like, I actually do think that at the time, when you put Destiny into historical context, I think that's an important point. That he really was coming in at a time, exactly as you say, where like these right wingers were dominating, and he came in and kind of like gave them a taste of their own medicine, except with actual arguments that were good,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And I think exposed a lot of them, and he often, I think I've heard him say about that 20%, which is probably smaller, of people who are watching who are maybe willing to be moved. Um, that the key, he thinks, is like when he can embarrass the person that they supposedly like that can maybe have some sort of impact where they'll be like, oh, the
right.
guy that I was kind of leaning towards, like his points kind of seem stupid, and maybe. So yeah, I mean, that's interesting, but I think also, like, he calls people stupid a lot and idiots, and I just feel like he
Yeah,
goes a little far with that sometimes. But I do also think that most people who criticize him haven't actually spent the time to really like understand what his arguments are, like because they just see the little clips of him calling someone a fucking idiot or stupid, or like, how
yeah,
can you
yeah,
be so retarded or whatever.
yeah, yeah,
And like those, obviously there's those things that gain a lot of attention of him defending certain views that seem, like I think the whole what was it, what was his name, the big riot, and then the guy who defended himself with
Oh, yeah, the Kenosha shooting, yeah.
the Kenosha shooting, right?
Kyle
Like
Rittenhouse, yeah.
Kyle Rittenhouse, yeah, that whole thing, right? So like like these, he keeps on falling into these situations where people can build a certain narrative about him. But I think people take the time, they'll actually see that there's more good faith there than what is portrayed. sometimes I feel similarly. This is maybe going to be a weird connection to make, but sometimes I feel similarly about like Joe Rogan. Like I don't actually agree with him, but like he's not as bad as people think he is often on the left.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Yeah. I feel like a lot of there seems to be this really weird like mob mentality on the online left where in one way that that manifests is like the online left will just latch on to certain figures and then just like completely dehumanize them and just like attack them relentlessly, right? Like the one person who I think I'm guilty of doing this towards is Dave Rubin, but that's more just because I think Dave Rubin is really funny. Like the things that he says is really funny. But like there's a lot of this like people will just decide, you know, I hate Joe Rogan or I hate Elon Musk. And then it's like anything they do or anything they say, there's just this giant Twitter mob attacking them.
Totally. So
Yeah.
frustrating. I mean,
Yeah.
yesterday actually, me and Matt, the two political guys from our podcast, we went on the Vanguard podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with them. And look,
Vaguely.
like they were both really nice guys. I'm pretty fond of them. I probably disagree with some of their takes, but their audience, oh my god, their chat was like just because we were so. I wonder if you'll be in. I think we kind of chatted about this maybe over direct message earlier, but you know, sort of what we were arguing for is that like the left should be like outcome oriented, right? And it's like I think I describe myself in my Twitter bio as a nonpartisan leftist, and what I mean by that is, you know, there's a tendency to get emotionally attached to like certain labels, so like socialism, and you can even see this sort of weird distortion or fixation on labels happen in an analogous example, which is like when everybody wanted to call Trump a fascist. I think what we should be doing instead of calling people labels is just it's lazy to lean on the label because you forget what makes Trump actually bad. Like talk about what he's doing that actually sucks specifically, rather than just being like fascist. When you just like hide behind the fascist label, you get to be a lazy thinker and not actually realize and take to the front of your mind why what he's doing is actually bad specifically. Similarly for socialism, I feel like rather than just fixating around the label, we should be talking about specifically what kind of a society do we want to be building? What kind of outcomes do we want? I want a society where we can make as many people as possible flourish. And I don't really care how we do it, right? So like I'm agnostic, or it's an empirical question, right? Like how we're gonna do it, best do it. But like, so it might be the case that sometimes market solutions are the thing. But yeah, obviously when I was saying all this on that podcast, a lot of the chat was just like, get these fucking centrists out of here, get these
Right. Yeah.
lib cucks out of here. But yeah, I don't know if you have reactions to that.
Yeah. So there's this phenomenon. Have you read are you familiar with the book Politics is for Power?
No, I'm not actually.
So one of the points that's made in that book is that if you look at people who engage with politics, and you look at the way that they actually spend their time engaging with politics, it seems like all of the time people spend is focusing on sort of, you know, far away, important but sort of far away headline issues, and, you know, listening to just podcasts and reading stuff, and almost no time is spent, you know, sort of actually engaging in activities that might bring about change, like engaging in like local organizing or local elections or things like that. And basically what he calls it is political hobbyism. And it's this idea that the way that people tend to engage with politics is less because they're concerned with actually making change, and more just sort of, it's an exercise in self-identity, right? And that gets really frustrating because sometimes you'll make arguments like, hey, or like you'll try to be pragmatic, for example, right? And you'll say like, hey, maybe we should maybe we should not call ourselves socialist or something. Maybe we should just focus on policy. And then people will get really mad at that because the reason that they're interested in politics in the first place is because it's like their identity as socialist is like important to them, rather than like their actual desire to see the change that we talk about. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think it's I've come to similar conclusions like through some other ideas, you know, but I think the identity point is actually so important because I do think that there's a lot of fixation on like kind of almost like an affective enjoyment from being attached to a certain label, and kind of the what to use kind of like psychoanalytic terms, which is one of my like favorite fields of like theory sometimes, or yeah, one of my favorite fields of theory is like Lacanian psychoanalysis. And like in that view, the view often says, you know, we are struggling to find some stabilizing identity. And I guess we often get attached to these, what he calls master signifiers. And there's a lot of enjoyment derived by kind of constructing this fantasy in our mind that, like, underneath this master signifier, we can feel whole again if we just like, affirm that identity and then obviously like people get very hostile when you try to kind of disrupt that sort of fantasy construction. So yeah, I definitely agree with you. I wanted to ask also about, like what's your educational background or your study background or your plans to study? Because it does, I mean, you seem pretty knowledgeable about philosophy. Are you self-taught or have you done any education on that?
Yeah, so my education, so at least so far, is that I barely passed high school, and then I've spent a bunch of time like illegally downloading like studies and papers on like Sci-Hub and like reading them for my own enjoyment. That's pretty much been it. I'm entirely self-taught, yeah.
Wow.
Which I guess sometimes I run into certain problems or insecurities with that, where it's like, can I really feel confident in this position? Yeah, but that's basically my educational background. Yeah.
Well, let me tell you a story. Like, that sounds familiar what you're telling me, because I can tell you that when I finished high school, my average was like D minus. Like I was a terrible high school student. I hated doing my homework. So I have this weird thing where when somebody is like over my shoulder telling me like what I need to be doing all the time, like I have this tendency to just not want to do it, especially when it's about stuff that I didn't care about. I mean, part of it was probably that I was just too young, but I've kind of realized as I've gotten older that I feel like I need to have a really strong sense of autonomy or like self-directedness.
Mm.
Like I don't like to have set kind of benchmarks for when I have to have something done. And I think in high school there's a lot more small assignments they have to hand in, and I would just always fall behind. So then in the city that I grew up in Ottawa, there's a university, Carleton, that had this kind of ability to enroll as a special student. So like I didn't really know what I was doing with my life. I think I was probably like 5 years out of high school. And I was like, okay, well, I'll enroll as a special student. And basically you do 2 courses per semester. And then if you do well on those, then they'll admit you full time based on kind of like how well you do. And I took like some philosophy courses and it like totally changed. I all of a sudden felt motivated. It's like, all I have to do is write this one essay by a certain time and I can do it however I want. Like it just really changed. So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes these things can come a little bit later, but I was always interested in philosophical questions, but for some reason, like I just didn't really have the confidence until I think I was like a little bit older and more mature. And then, I really love academic philosophy. And, I mean, it sounds like something that you would probably be really good at if you wanted to do it, but obviously you got your YouTube thing going on. But do you ever think about figuring out some path to go back, or does it not really appeal to you?
Well, yeah, I'm only like 18. I just recently finished high school, so I am planning on going into college.
Oh,
Uh,
you're only 18. Holy shit.
yeah, yeah. I think I'm planning on studying public policy, but that's always subject to change, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd really enjoy philosophy, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, that's cool. Um, yeah. So another thing, like, so it seems like in a lot of your debates, the thing that really stood out to me is, you have quite a strong recall of studies, right? Like you often come armed. You have. I noticed this move where you'll be like, this person has really done really good research on this, and like you'll start naming like studies. So how do you prepare? What's that process like for you if you're going to debate somebody? Like how much reading do you do? Like, do you take notes? Like and do you have them in front of you at the debate? Like what does that look like?
Yeah. So I have a strong belief in the necessity of like, I guess, examining empirical research before forming opinions on like the efficacy of certain policies, or things like that. And I guess the reason is it seems like throughout history, there have been so many times where we just like intuitively think a certain thing, and then upon further investigation, like it turns out to be wrong, because there are just certain, the world is so complex that there's always going to be certain factors that like our intuition is just not well equipped to take into account. So like, for example, the argument against the minimum wage has always been, well, we can't raise the minimum wage because wages are set by supply and demand in the labor market. And so raising it would cause businesses to no longer be able to afford as many workers. But then it's like the problem with that is that that model is overly simplistic, and it doesn't take into account things like monopsony, where because there's such high concentration in labor markets, or wages are actually set below what they would be set in a free market, and by like strict supply and demand mechanisms. And so there actually is room to raise the minimum wage without causing disemployment. And I could go on for like examples of this kinds of thing for like forever. But I
Right.
guess that's just why I think like looking at empirical evidence rather than just relying on intuition is really important when I'm coming to my positions. So when I'm thinking about any given issue, whether that be, you know, what do I think about like trans issues even, or what do I think about a certain economic policy or a certain economic concept, I'll generally spend like a lot of time trying to read all of the studies that I can find on a given issue, and I'll like take notes. I'll be like, okay, so this study says this, and this is the basic methodology that it used. And I'll try to like compare different studies, see what the consensus generally points to. Sometimes like if I have like a debate that I'm like really nervous for, sometimes I'll like write out like a research document. Like I did this for the Euron Brook debate, where I kind of like have all of the sources that I think I'll need in front of me so I can bring it up. But usually I don't. Usually it's just kind of memory based, right? Like if someone's making the point that like socialism or redistribution suppresses entrepreneurship, I'll be like, oh, I remember I read all these papers by Gareth Olds that said that it actually increases entrepreneurship by giving people more economic security. So yeah, it's kind of like that.
That's that seems like an unusual high aptitude to be able to do that. Like, I don't think that I could be able to memorize that stuff. And
Mm.
you know, I mean, you don't have to answer this, but it's funny to me that you're able to remember all these things and recall them. But you said, you know, high school was a bit of a challenge. Was it just because you didn't care about high school, or like, or this?
More or less, yeah. I have like pretty bad ADHD, so like it's hard for me to bring myself to do things or learn about things if I'm not like genuinely really interested in them. So like when it comes to like algebra, it's like I don't care. Like I just don't care. And so when it's like I have to do my algebra homework, it takes like an incredible amount of like willpower to bring myself to do that. And more often than not, I would just end up like just not being able to bring myself. But when it comes to, I guess, political issues, politics is just something that I have like a super high level of, I guess, curiosity about and interest in. And so when I'm like reading papers and writing them down, it's less of like a task and more of like I'm doing it for fun because I'm fulfilling some like curiosity that I have, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, like I said, I think it resonates with me a lot. I think I had somewhat of a similar experience. I was never diagnosed with ADHD, so I have no idea if I have that, but I still, you know, even now as a doctoral student, you know, and I actually did 2 master's degrees because I was like very indecisive about what I was going to do. I did one in urban planning, and I also did one in philosophy. And then now I'm in political science and doing political theory as kind of a like a middle ground, I guess, between planning and philosophy or something. But yeah, like, I mean, I still think my process to get stuff done is so lazy. Like, you know, my girlfriend, like, she's a PhD student also. She has so many notes and everything all organized, and I'm just kind of like, I don't know, like I have to build in like probably 60% procrastination time into my expected time of doing actual work. Even now, it's like very I don't know, it's worked out for me and I've gotten this far, so hopefully it'll continue. But yeah. I was, you know, I know you sent me before. You'd written this essay about you know, Richard Wolff's view, and you know, I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit if you're interested. Like, so
Yeah.
maybe could you run down like the basic argument? I mean, I know I really like Richard Wolff, and I remember the first time I came across him, I think I watched a Google Talks that he had on YouTube, and I thought he makes very compelling, interesting arguments. but ultimately, like, there's some ambiguity about in what ways is he actually advocating for like kind of a socialist social transformation as opposed to just like being a champion of like worker democracy. So I don't know, maybe you could run down some of the tensions you identified in him.
Yeah, so I guess my issue primarily comes in his model that he advocates for of market socialism. Um, so his critique of central planning is one that I agree with, and his critique is that if you have like essentially a highly centrally planned economy like that in the Soviet Union, um, there is no meaningful, workers don't really have much meaningful power over where they work, right? It's still a highly authoritarian structure within the workplace. And that creates all sorts of problems, right? Like when workers feel like they don't have power over their work, they become alienated, there becomes political tensions and inequalities. And that's all very harmful, right? And so I think that's a
Hmm.
very valid critique of central planning. Um, and I guess his proposed alternative, I think, goes too far in the other direction, where all businesses are just solely run by the workers. And the revenues of businesses just accrue and are distributed solely by the workers who work at those firms. And I guess the two problems I have with that are that really they're just two problems with capitalism in general that I don't think worker co-ops necessarily fix. The first is that if you have revenue being distributed by the workers in a given firm that's producing the revenue, and they're the ones who distribute it amongst themselves, that certainly is going to reduce inequality within the firm, right? Now there's no longer a CEO who's getting all of the revenue and a bunch of workers who are getting table scraps. So it reduces inequality in that sense, but it does not reduce inequality between different firms, right? So even in a sort of worker co-op economy, different worker co-ops are going to vary massively in how
Hmm.
profitable they are, right? And so there's still going to be certain workers who work for a highly profitable co-op, some workers who work for less profitable co-ops, and there's going to be a lot of economic inequality in that respect. The other issue that I have is when it comes to internalizing externalities, where it seems like one of the major problems with capitalism is that firms act in the interest of the firm, even at the expense of acting in the interest of society broadly. So like climate change is a good example where like firms will pollute the environment because polluting the environment is profitable for them, but it hurts society, but they don't care because that cost to society doesn't show up on their balance sheet, right? And the same is true with a worker co-op, right? Like I see no reason why a worker co-op fossil fuel company would have any less of an incentive, because it's still going to be the case that those workers in the co-op, even if it's a democratic profit, they're still going to be profiting from polluting the environment, and they're not going to internalize the social cost. Um, and so, yeah, I guess those are my problems. And then my alternative, which I guess we can get into a bit more if you want, but just vaguely, my alternative is you have worker power through unions and through co-determination policies where like maybe workers have certain representation on like boards of directors, or workers have certain amounts of shares. And then on the alternative side, you have state control in some sense in terms of nationalization of certain industries. But then obviously we want the market in some industries. And so where we have a market, you have sort of indirect state ownership through a social wealth fund where the state buys up stocks in the competing companies in the market, and can internalize externalities in that respect.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd never like thought about the social wealth fund, but I did want to ask something about, the critique of, I think you're right. I'm convinced that obviously the like Wolf's proposal, right? There's going to be inequality between firms. Um, but like, I'd be curious, how is that a bad thing? Or like, is inequality, right? Like, I guess the question would be, um, to what extent is inequality unjustifiable? To what extent maybe is it justifiable? Or like, how do you see that in this context?
Yeah, so I guess this sort of gets deeper into like my broader moral framework, right? Um, and I guess kind of the way that I think about it is inequality isn't always bad. Um, but generally speaking, I think inequality creates problems, firstly, in that it can be harmful to social cohesion, right? Like if
Hmm.
there's some people who are much more rich than other people, that creates conflict between those two groups of people. Also, if wealth and income is distributed massively unevenly, people who get more of that wealth therefore are able to garner more political power, which I think is also problematic and is toxic to democracy. I think when you have large amounts of inequality, you have situations where people on the lower end of that aren't as able to sort of participate in society, right? To a degree that they find fulfilling. This is actually an argument that Marx made that I really like, which is if you have like a bunch of people and they all live in like a small hut, right? Then the person who lives in the small hut is going to be like, oh, okay, whatever, this is fine because this is like the norm. But then if you have a situation where like 3 people live in a hut and then a bunch of people live in a mansion, then the people in the hut are going to be like, oh, wait, what's going on here? And all of a sudden they're going to be more dissatisfied, right? Because of
Right.
that inequality. And this is why researchers actually, a lot of people criticize the relative poverty metric because they think it's sort of a measure of low end inequality. And in a respect, it is, right? Like relative poverty is just measured by if you're like, I think 50% below the medium income. And the reason we do that is because it's meaningful to talk about how many people are barred from participating in like the basic norms and activities that you're expected to participate when you live in a certain society. So I think inequality can be harmful to all those respects, or
Yeah,
in all those respects. Yeah.
I agree with that for sure. I think, but I guess it's the the question is, what are the conditions when it is justifiable, right? Because I guess there's a certain sense in which people are obviously going to have different potential talents, and they're going to have people are going to have more or less favorable, for example, psychological dispositions. And I don't know how familiar you are with like Rawlsian arguments, right? Like the veil
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Like
ignorance
the
and stuff.
difference principle. Yeah.
The difference principle. I'm
Mhm.
curious, like, how does that set, like, or do you find that to be a convincing argument, or would you want stronger equality than that?
Yeah, no, I actually generally do agree with the Rawlsian difference principle. Like, inequality can be justified insofar as it's beneficial to like the least well-off people, right? So, like, if paying doctors more means that there's more doctors, and that's helpful to all the poor people who need doctors, and they're better off, as opposed to if doctors were paid less, then of course, I think that inequality is justified. But I guess I don't trust the market, even a co-op market, to create inequalities on that basis, right? Like in a co-op market, inequality is just going to be created on the basis of which firms the market decides are more profitable than other firms, right? Rather than which inequalities are actually beneficial to people, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess the idea of wealth funds, as you mentioned, maybe you could say a little bit more about that because I'm curious. But I guess the idea would be that those kinds of sort of institutional implementations would be a way of getting to like that sort of Rawlsian difference principle, or it could be a way.
Yeah, it could be. Because basically what you have when you have a social wealth fund is a lot of the shares in in a given company are owned by the state. And so when a company generates revenue, rather than just going to either a CEO or the workers in that firm, a lot of that revenue goes directly to the state to be like redistributed, right? And so this is beneficial in terms of inequality. So like okay, so like one example that I could give is I've mentioned inequality between firms. Another thing I could mention is inequality between people who work in general and people who don't work in general, right? And this is a problem that's often underestimated by a lot of people, because if you actually look at the statistics, about half of the population, like 50% of the population, are classified as non-workers, like people who don't work. And most of that 50% is people who don't work because they're disabled or they're elderly or they're children or they're caretakers or students. Generally people who not only aren't working but shouldn't be working. Like we as a society shouldn't expect them to work. And so under a market system, sort of there is no way, unless you have like a sort of a welfare state, right? There's no way to distribute money to non-workers, right? Because all the money that businesses are generating is going to the workers, even in a co-op system in that firm. And so the idea of a social wealth fund is that a lot of the revenue is going to the state, and then the state can redistribute that revenue among the population in ways that are democratically determined. And so I think that puts us in a better decision, or in a better position to decide democratically to distribute revenue in ways that we determine would make society better, rather than in ways that the market determines.
Right. And then what kind of democratic mechanism do you think would work? So would that be like, I guess, implementing some sort of worker democracy, or like just like, do you think electoral politics, I guess is my question, is sufficient for that? Or do we need some further forms of democratization?
So I generally advocate for I generally advocate for like representative democracy, but sort of, I guess, furthering how democratic that is, right? And one way to do that is, obviously you can have like laws that outlaw things like lobbying. You can have laws that limit inequalities so that, there's the government is more representative of everyone rather than just people who have disproportionate amounts of economic resources. You can even do that through unions. There's one example that I like to bring up from Finland, where there was, I think, a prime minister. I might butcher this story, but I think there was like a prime minister who tried to cut pay for a certain group of workers. And that's like, I mean, in America, that would be like nothing, right? Like that happens all the time.
Mhm.
But in Finland, that was so not well received that there was a general strike, right? And what we have to remember is that in Finland, unions cover like 91% of workers, right? And so unions were so large that the workers could say, hey, no, you can't cut pay. We're going to go on a general strike. And as a result, that prime minister had to resign, right?
Oh, wow.
And so that's just one example of sort of building up alternative structures like unions and community organization structures can sort of be a check against the power of the state, or can make the state be more meaningfully representative of, I guess, the will of the people, if you want to put it in those terms.
Yeah, no, I'm sympathetic to that for sure. I wonder, I was actually talking about this last night on the Vanguard. One of the things that's, I think the left sometimes doesn't talk about or enough, I think, is, and I guess maybe I have a bias because this is something we study in political science all the time, is just like the institutional makeup of American politics is just so bad that, like, to make a change like that, like, the fact that it has so many veto points, right? If you know what that means, right? There's
Yeah.
just so many places where legislation can stop that, even if Bernie Sanders would have won and been president, it's like the difference it would have made would have been like foreign policy and like some executive orders, but like
Mhm.
structural change, just it would have made almost no difference. Like I mean, maybe it would have made a symbolic difference, right? It would have seemed like there was something, and I think one of the differences in Canada, like, our system's not perfect for sure. There's problems with it, but I think parliamentary systems, broadly speaking, what's good about them is when a party wins all the seats, they just get to do what they said they were going to do, right? Like they actually have legislative freedom. And then, you might get, like we had before Trudeau, we had like 10, 11 years of like Harper conservatism.
Mhm.
And it's like, yeah, it was kind of bad, but at least he got to do what he wanted to do. And then we got to see it. And then we got to actually judge whether we liked it or not, right? Whereas in the
Right.
States, it's like nobody actually gets to do anything. So everyone's just blaming everyone else for nothing happening. And I
Yeah.
guess like that seems like such a like big puzzle about how do you overcome that? I mean, how do you change the institutions? I mean, it seems almost fucking impossible. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Right.
it's
Right.
it,
Yeah.
well, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that there's a part of that that I do agree with. I think that in a large part, the way that the American government was constructed was like a very sort of checks and balances oriented thing, where like the sort of the intention was that, we have to sort of force some level of compromise in order to do things, because we don't want, if someone gets elected, we don't just want them to be able to do whatever. They have to get approval from the courts and from Congress, etc. um, when it comes to how we deal with that, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not really sure. I mean, it would probably be better if we had a system where people could more easily do things. I am sympathetic to that argument. When it comes to how to deal with that, um, I would say realistically, we're very far away from being able to do anything like abolish the Senate or abolish the Supreme Court or anything like that. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So, I mean, the best thing that we can do at this point is just try and get more people on the left elected. Um, in Congress, try and run more AOCs in places where, progressives, like in places like New York, where progressives can reasonably get elected, and just hope that over time we can grow a stronger sort of electoral presence of the left, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really is all you can do. And I think
Mhm.
what's so frustrating about some online leftists, right, is when they, I think the reason why the sort of institutional observation is important is because already the stuff that they say sometimes when they're trying to, I don't know, force the vote and do all these things that are kind of cringy, it's like, and then when, if you really like hold firm, or you hold in the front of your mind like these institutional barriers, it's like, that seems even more stupid. I feel like it's like you have to
Yeah.
just, you can't have like, these radical demands are just so frustrating because yeah, it is just going to be that boring work of, the trudgery of trying to get like grassroots people elected as much as you can. But yeah, I mean, it's not an easy path. I mean, to some extent, I'm not all that optimistic
Yeah. No,
about
I
about
totally
about
agree with you. With regards to, a lot of people on the left sort of have a fundamental misunderstanding of like how our government works. Um, and I guess this can most be seen on sort of the, I guess, like a Jimmy Dore-ish side of things, where there's a lot of talk about like, oh, why hasn't AOC done this? Why hasn't Biden do this? Why didn't Obama do this? Um, and they sort of take the fact that like AOC hasn't unilaterally enacted Medicare for all, and then they run with this rhetoric of like, oh, AOC is a traitor, right? And it's like, well, no, I mean, we have to understand that there are limits to what our elected officials can do. Even a more sort of I guess another example of this would be like a lot of people will be like, well, why didn't Obama? They'll be like, well, Obamacare is insufficient. Why didn't Obamacare pass a single payer healthcare system? And it's like, well, there are valid critiques of Obama, but even if he wanted to pass single payer, it would have never happened. He didn't have the votes, right?
yeah.
There's a narrow majority in Congress, and even the Democratic Congress people were like almost entirely against a single payer. Um, so yeah, I do think it's important to sort of give our politicians at least more leeway, or like more understanding insofar as like the conditions that they're working with, rather than just doing these sorts of knee-jerk attacks that a lot of people try to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the problems too, back to earlier, we were talking about sort of the psychology of the sort of enjoyment and pleasure people get out of, like kind of being radical or whatever. And I think
Mhm.
that plays so strongly with this. It's just,
Yes, yes.
it's so fun to condemn people, right? Like
Mhm.
that's such a strong like and relevant cognitive bias in our political discourse that like you just have to notice how much fun you're having when you get to condemn people, and it's actually like a little bit less, I guess, libidinally or psychologically satisfying to be like, I don't know, a careful thinker, or at least it seems that way anyway. I mean, it's just, I
Yeah.
don't know.
It's almost like there's this old right-wing term of like virtue signaling, right? It's almost like that, where it's like it feels better to just condemn people like AOC, because then you get to say, oh, I'm the most radical one. I'm the real lefty. Everyone else is a fake lefty. And it's sort of like a self-flagellatory thing, I guess.
Yeah, it's also kind of, I think, related to sort of implicit ideas of moral purity, right? It's like people don't want to
Mhm.
contaminate their morally righteous perspectives that they so enjoy,
Right,
right?
right, yeah.
By being contaminating it by compromise, right? It's such a dirty word. I mean, I know, I mean, it's fresh in my mind because I was on the Vanguard yesterday, but I remember somebody in the chat was like, I think Matt was talking about incrementalism, about how like sometimes that's important. And like,
Mhm.
oh my God, the hatred for like even
Yeah,
mentioning the
yeah.
word incrementalism
Mhm.
was, yeah, was insane. But, I don't know. Oh yeah. I was going to ask you about, I was wondering, I don't know how much time you have, but if you're cool
Oh yeah, I'm
to,
free. Yeah.
okay. Okay. um, Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I remember the thing I was going to mention. So I recently read, well, audiobook. I don't know if you ever listen to audiobooks, but I sometimes do because I feel like if I'm not work, if I can only really afford to actually read things that are related to my dissertation. So any other pleasure reading, I kind of
Mhm.
just like do with Audible. But I don't know if you heard about it recently. This book that came out called The Scout Mindset. by Julia Galef. I think you'd really like it. Basically, like, she makes this argument for, like, it's basically about cognitive biases and how to kind of try to overcome them. And she says that, like, usually when we argue, the metaphor we use is like soldier mindset, right? Where it's like, I'm going to defend my position, I'm going to attack. Like, all the metaphors are like about war. Debunk, right? And then she says, actually we should try to cultivate what she calls a scout mindset, meaning, what's a scout doing, right? Just surveying the world and creating a map and then revising the map as you go along, as opposed to just like being a soldier mindset, scout mindset.
Right.
And I really like the metaphor. I think it was very compelling. And one of the examples she actually brings up some political examples. And she talks about how, like, the soldier mindset is so entrenched in political discourse and hostility. And I think she talks about how during the AIDS epidemic, when it was new, a lot of the activists who were like really angry at the government, and I think at that time it might have been Reagan or Bush the first, I can't remember, it was one of those two, and they weren't really paying that much attention to it, right? Because at the time, of course, it was perceived to just be like a gay plague, right, pejoratively, and like, who cares? So there's a lot of activists who wanted to push for more research, and they did all their like cringy political tactics, right, where they're being like, with this logic of like angry opposition. I think they like chain themselves to like the desk of like the head of the NIH, like the National Institutes of Health, to like do more research, right? But like, obviously nothing happened. But then like they realized that they had to try something else, so they started looking into the research, right, like specifically learning about how it works, and then like coming to them with an alternate proposal of the kind of research that could be done. And they basically entered into the system. And what's interesting about it is, like, a lot of the activists, the heads of the activist organizations, kind of admitted and talked about how, like, kind of initially how deflationist it felt to kind of be part of the system, when before they were like deriving a lot of kind of enjoyment and power from taking these righteous stands. But what it resulted, actually, because of their research and their insights, it actually resulted in the research changing directions and actually leading to, like, I forget what it's called, PrEP, or whatever these drugs are that people use for who have AIDS, that can basically bring your viral load down to zero. And it resulted from them kind of compromising and entering into the system. And she talks about it as an example of kind of like scout mindset, of how you kind of have to, try to see the world the way it is, not the way you want to see it, right? And I think the righteous attitude sometimes is based on that.
Right.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think you'd like the book, so you might enjoy checking it out. The other thing I was curious about is, I wonder if I could persuade. I mean, I'll see if I can persuade you of something. I have like kind of a hot take on democracy. I mean, I don't know how hot it is. It's like very, very academic-y. So I'll see if I can like explain it persuasively here. But basically, like, I think electoral politics create very perverse incentives, especially American electoral politics. So, I mean, we can go through a list of perverse incentives that are created, but I think a lot of them are pretty obvious. So, like, I'm sure you've thought of them, like party discipline, right? Like the fact that often politicians are elected and they have a motivation to just be loyal to the party. They have a motivation to kind of work their way up the party hierarchy, right? And you have to think about this in contrast with the kind of the incentive towards, I guess we could say, social empowerment or egalitarian values or the common good, right? These are all the things that we would hope that our politicians are doing. But I think that there's so many perverse incentives. So that's one. Obviously, the incentive to be reelected is a huge one. Like, I think that prevents politicians from being oriented towards social empowerment. Fundraising, right? Like another one. Also, this is another really big one, right? The fact that they are often attuned to trying to make the other side look bad. So you might get into a situation, right, where both parties know that the evidence is like good on some policy proposal, but then if they see that the other party is trying to pass it, they don't want to give that other party an electoral victory, right? They don't want to make the other party look good. So there's an incentive to actually stop. So there's a few other ones, but like those kinds of perverse incentives have kind of led me to return actually to ancient Athens and think that maybe we should be getting rid of electoral politics and replacing it with something called sortition, which would use random sampling. And it would be kind of like jury duty, except we might call it civic duty. So there would be no elections, and you'd get a random representative sample of the population, and they would be selected to come and serve in some like legislative body. Like there's obviously a lot of details that we would have to go into about, you know, how it would work, but um, I think that they would have all the kinds of resources that a currently elected person would have, right? Like they would have a staff, they would have researchers, there would be like legislative rules, there'd be like an oversight committee. But the idea behind that would be that the reason I find it appealing is because it would eliminate all those perverse incentives, right? So there'd be no incentive to be reelected because you can't be reelected, right? And you could only ever serve once. So I wonder, just initially, how does that sound on your ears?
Yeah, so I think that sounds interesting in the sense that it seems to overcome certain valid observations that you made about certain flaws of electoral democracy. I guess the question, of course, just ultimately comes down to, would this system have its own flaws that sort of supersede that? And thinking about what those may be. So one example that I could think of is, so it might be the case that democracy provides some mechanism through which the people who are creating policy, like people, there's a certain filter there where like certain people are filtered out who like we wouldn't want making public policy, right? So like, for example, maybe like we wouldn't want like Jeffrey Dahmer as our president, right? And a democracy kind of addresses that because, you know, if people have to vote, nobody's going to vote for Jeffrey Dahmer if they know he kills people, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like one of my concerns would be like if you're just picking people randomly and there's no filter for who it can be, like what's to stop like someone being elected who's just like a complete psychopath, right? Or something like that. I guess that'd be like one of my concerns.
Yeah. So that's a good concern. I mean, I think you're actually raising, as I see it, there's two strong objections to it, and I think you've kind of hit on one of them, which is, you could broadly call it competence, right?
Mm,
So it's like we have to worry about the competence of these. I mean, I would imagine that there would be similar filters that you have for jury duty, right?
mm,
So like, like obviously jury duty has a filter where, yeah, you can be randomly selected, but if you have like, I don't know, psychopathic tendencies or something, you'd expect that those people would be filtered out. But I think like one of the really interesting advantages of sortition is, right now, who's in Congress, right? It's like lawyers. It's like, do we want that to be the people who are just like deciding what is in the common good? Where's working class representation, right? So like if it's actually a representative sample of people, you would expect that you would have a roughly equal number of working class people in there to express their interests. So I don't know, does that seem compelling to you?
yeah, it does. I guess I just have a sort of a visceral feeling of like, maybe this is just me being elitist, but I don't know, like a lot of the people I've interacted with on my day-to-day life, like it sounds very scary to have these people being the ones who are making decisions in a sense, where
Yeah.
it's like there's so many people. I would say the vast majority of people in America are people who just like have no familiarity with politics and are just like very emotional in their reactions to things, and like couldn't really substantiate any of their positions on anything. And I guess it's just worrisome. I feel like maybe democracy provides some kind of a filter where it's like people who are being elected are people who at least have some competence with regards to political issues, I guess.
Yeah, for
um,
sure. I mean, I think
yeah.
that's a valid concern. There's some anecdotal examples that I could offer. So I think the most prominent one is in the province of British Columbia. I think in like 2007 or 2008, there was a citizens council that was selected according to sortition to consider electoral reform. So they were like looking at changing from first past the post, right, to like a proportional representation system. So they wanted to assemble a citizens council, and it was selected on according to sortition. And I think what's interesting about that example is like you had people come in and they had the status quo bias where they were like, let's just stick to the system. It's what I know. I don't understand what mixed member proportional is. I don't understand what single transferable vote or all these complicated things are. Right. But then like when they took the time to examine the policy issue, right, and they're presented with experts on both sides who kind of explain to them, similar to the way you have like a prosecution and a defense in jury duty, right, in a criminal trial, And what you ended up happening at the end of that was like it went from something like, I don't know, 20% being open to change to like 90 or 80% people who were like, yeah, we have to change it. All the advantages of proportional representation way outweigh. So like I guess the idea would be like, I agree with you that people are very like low information and like are scary, but I think that one of the problems is because people don't have right now the incentive to actually read up and look at an issue. And I think that if you're selected for a sortition assembly, and we assume that they're going to get paid for this, right? They're going to get the same salary as a like what an elected representative gets now, right? I think there's going to be an incentive to actually examine the issue. And you know, in some other examples similar to the British Columbia one, people talk about, you know, how they felt a sense of responsibility, like they felt like, oh, like you know, and I think you see similar things occur in jury duty where people actually feel a real sense of responsibility. Now, don't get me wrong, jury duty has its problems, like there are documented issues with it. But I guess, like, you know, when you compare how bad electoral democracy is, I'm sort of persuaded that I think that it could be an interesting solution. So I don't know what do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely an interesting potential solution. I would have to think about it a bit more, I guess. Yeah, I don't know how it would work out. Um,
Yeah.
there's another thing I've heard of, or another model I've heard of, that may be interesting, which is like the idea is that you have sort of like councils that are designated to like certain aspects of policy, right? So you might have like a healthcare policy council or like a foreign trade policy council, and you have like the population, like the democratic population, vote like via direct democracy on sort of like broad policy proposals, and then
Mm-hmm.
it's like councils of experts who are just sort of tasked with taking those broad proposals that people voted for and then turning them into like actual like working policy, I guess.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't. So the idea would be like people like everyone would be eligible to vote
Mhm.
for something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. That's like expanding direct democracy. And I think, you know, it's funny because my problem with like that kind of direct democracy and the reason why I like sortition better is because I worry about the low information voter, right? Because if everyone is getting to vote in direct democracy, then really the low information voter is actually a real threat. Whereas like my thinking is when you have a random sample that's representative, then those people are actually going to be incentivized to be high information voters, right? And it's like that's a problem that I see direct democracy happening where like low information voters threaten good decisions. And I feel like sortition is like a solution to that problem in my
Okay.
that's my thinking
Mhm.
about it anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that makes sense.
I mean, if you're curious, I could tell you too what the other like the other main objection to sortition, I guess, is
Oh
like
yeah, sure, go for it. Mhm.
is I guess democratic legitimacy, right? It's like the fact that only people selected have an input, like it kind of creates a problem of democratic legitimacy. So it's like if like the rest of the public really hates something that the sortition chamber does, like how is there a way to
Mm,
overcome that, right? Like and something feels wrong about that, right? Like so you're saying if I don't get picked, I just have no say
right.
in what
Yeah,
gets
yeah.
decided, right? Like that seems bad.
Mhm.
And I guess like the solution that I propose to that would be to kind of adopt a Swiss model, a Swiss augmentation of the system where maybe you could have like if you collect 100,000 or whatever, however many signatures, you could trigger an automatic referendum. But I would
Mm,
want it to undo what the sortition chamber did, but it would have to reach a very high bar. Like I would want it to have like 80% voter participation and like 60% majority or something, like a clear majority and
mhm.
high voter participation.
Right.
So that's yeah, I don't know. That's that's my thinking about that issue if you
Yeah.
find it interesting.
Mhm. No, I think that makes sense. Yeah. I would have to think about it more because this is it would be a very like radical change. Yeah.
It
So
would
it's,
be.
yeah.
It would absolutely be a radical change. But yeah, I kind of I came across it when I was in this democratic theory seminar, and
Mm,
you know, just that problem of low information voters was like really on my mind, and it seemed like a compelling solution.
mm.
But yeah, so I was also curious, like what other stuff you've sort of been thinking about lately, because I think I saw you tweet yesterday and I responded, right, that you're going to be coming out with a video, maybe a video essay that you were happy with. I mean, you can, if you want, I'd be curious if you want to preview some of the things you've been thinking about here.
Oh yeah. So it's kind of like a sort of a response to Ben Shapiro. Um, Ben Shapiro made this new show called Debunked, and he uploaded one of his episodes to YouTube, and it's called Debunked transgender ideology, right?
Oh God.
In other words, he's very upset that, about trans people like requesting, basic human rights, human dignity, etc. Um, and he's kind of like the core of that video is like he's kind of arguing like, oh, how absurd it is to say that a man could be a woman or some, that kind of thing, right? Um, and so I've been thinking a lot about sort of the claim that trans women are women, the claim that trans men are men. And I've been thinking about how to evaluate that, how to argue for that. And my sort of thinking is that words obviously are just constructs that humans create for the purposes of our own utility. And a definition of a word, right, can't be like right or wrong, or like definitionally, right? Like I think in order for something to be correct or incorrect, it has to be like a proposition, right?
Yeah.
And a definition of a word, it's not a proposition, it's just us choosing to define a word in a certain way. Um, and so if a definition of a word can't be right or wrong, then how do we evaluate what's the quote unquote right way to use a word? Um, and my sort of thinking about that is because words are just constructs that we create for our own utility, the right definition of a word is just a definition that we derive the most utility from.
Hmm.
Um, and then so my argument would be that we get more utility out of a definition of woman, which is inclusive of trans women, because obviously trans people suffer great psychological stress when they feel as though society isn't recognizing them as the gender that they identify with. So that's sort of like my sort of from fundamental principles argument about the trans women are women claim, which is the sort of thing that Ben Shapiro is focused on attacking, I guess.
That's interesting. What you're saying makes me think about Ludwig Wittgenstein. If you're
Mm,
familiar with that philosopher, right? Like his argument is meaning is use, right? Like so, like the meaning of a word is its use in a language game, and a language game, really, what he means by that is just kind of like forms of life, like what we do in our life world. Like when we're
mm,
just out there engaging with things, we play different language games, right? Like when you're with your friends or whatever, or whatever. If I'm with my girlfriend and like I will speak about things and words might take on a different meaning because of the context, right? Because of
right,
how I'm using it, right? And like, I'm sure, like, if you're in a clique of friends, right? Sometimes those little cliques of friends have special little meanings that are particular to that group of friends where they'll use something and it's kind of like an inside joke, right? So like
right,
there's
right,
kind of all these language games. And I think you're exactly right that it's sort of based on utility in the sense that, those games we play with words, they're doing something, right? Like they're kind of fortifying a form of life. Like my group of friends, or like the world I create with my girlfriend, or the world you create with your friends, or whatever, right? Or your parents. It's like those games are part of kind of building up to that kind of like
right.
life world, right? So I think
Hmm.
that's interesting. So I think like that's a correct view in my opinion of language. But the trans issue, yeah, I mean that's tough. That's a tough one. Like because I guess there's I guess there's like potentially a utility to knowing someone's a trans woman as opposed to a
Right.
cis woman. So like I guess, there's utility to that distinction. Right, I guess.
Yeah, so I think that's true. But I think there's a difference between recognizing a distinction between women and trans women and using language in such a way where we are not designating trans women as women, right? Um,
Right.
like we can say that trans women are different from women, but they're both women. And I
Oh
think
yeah.
that gives us more utility than saying like just trans women are men, right? Um,
Yeah, oh yeah, I totally agree with you on that point. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I mean Shapiro, I mean he's cringy as fuck, like the
yeah.
worst. But yeah, I noticed that I think you've had a couple of other videos. What's and like you said, I didn't actually notice a video about Dave Rubin, but I know you mentioned him before, and you kind of said apologetically that you belittle him. But you know what? Like I think it's fine to to like belittle people when you've actually spent some time watching them. And I think in my opinion, Dave Rubin is worthy of some belittlement because he seems very like he seems like such a grifter to me. I don't know, like
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Yeah.
um
He's a huge grifter and he's just like, I don't know, just the things that he says are so hilariously stupid that I can't like laugh about it. Like, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a video where Dave Rubin is like, he makes the argument because he's talking about COVID, right? And he's talking about climate change. And he goes, the left says that we should trust the scientists, but that's a stupid notion. Haven't you seen science fiction movies? There are evil scientists. Like, that's like the argument that he made.
Yeah.
It's like unbelievable to me.
Yeah, and then obviously there's the funny one of like Dave Rubin versus words. That's also a
Yeah.
good one, right? I forget
Yeah.
what. There's a couple really funny ones. Yeah, he just totally misuses. Oh, like I think the gaslighting one is hilarious. I forget what he claims gaslighting is, but it's hilarious. It's like
He said that
hilariously wrong.
gaslighting is when you say something so crazy that it confuses your opponent or something like that.
Oh
I have
man,
no
yeah,
idea where he got the definition from, but
yeah, that's ridiculous. Cool. So I guess, I mean, do you have any questions for me or anything you're curious about?
let me think about that for a second. Oh, okay. So you talk in your article that you wrote that you sent to me
Oh yeah.
about sort of the issues of like punitive justice versus restorative justice. And I guess it's interesting to think about how those sorts of notions are often like people like on the online left, for example, will often pay a lot of lip service to like, we support restorative justice, right? And then they'll act in ways which kind of betray that ethic, right?
Yeah.
Do you sort of, is that the sort of sentiment that you think you were getting at, or is that something that you agree with?
Yeah, it is the sentiment that I was getting at. I mean, I think, right. I think the idea, yeah, I forgot that I sent that to you. That in the article, I kind of make this argument that like sometimes the left has kind of forgotten about its roots in what I see as is roots in compassion, right? That like, I think the left is supposed to be, I think, oriented towards, I guess, second chances and like keeping front of mind the inherent humanity in everybody when possible, when reasonable. And obviously the left, or some like, I mean, what people call broadly the SJW left, that there seems to be a kind of, when someone disagrees with you, they're no longer worthy of compassion, right? But then obviously there's a lot of people who are prison abolitionists, right, who think that criminals deserve our compassion, and I actually happen to agree with them, right? But I just think that compassion should be a leftist value that applies to everyone, even right wingers. And I think I also bring up an example in that article about people who were radicalized like on the right, and how like we should try to welcome them back, right? And like not hate them if they change their mind, because I think people are just trying to find a place in this world. And I think I mentioned that Christian Picciolino guy who used to be a neo-Nazi, and he talks about how the reason that neo-Nazism was so attracted to him was because it gave him like community and purpose and a sense of meaning. And it's like,
Yeah.
and that's just a very human desire, right? And it's like,
Right.
I think we should have compassion for that.
Yeah.
And be welcoming about that. And I think we just shoot ourselves in the foot when we have kind of this punitive, retributive logic of just like hating people who use the wrong word or use the N-word in some past video, and it's just counterproductive.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah. I guess that kind of ties in with like when people talk about like issues of like cancel culture or whatever. I think cancel culture is a weird thing because I feel like to some extent cancel culture has and will always exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's always going to be certain cultural values that any given society wants to reflect, and the converse of that is there's always going to be certain values that society tends to disassociate with and condemn people for. But then I guess the question is like where should the bar be, right? Like what should we be willing to condemn? And it feels like we've gotten to this point where it's like if you're like a soccer mom who like rapped the N-word along with like a rap song in her car one time, then you might as well be like, the Grand Wizard of the KKK or something. And I think it's just like a very crazy space to be in where that's how we think about these things.
Totally. And I mean, I think it's so related to what we've talked about a few times with what I've been referring to, like the pleasure of righteousness, right? Like I think so much of it stems from the kind of libidinal payoff, if you will, of just like condemning people, right? Like and I so when I did my master's in planning, I did it at a university here in Toronto called York University, which is very well known for being radical, like having a lot of radicalism, and like their union is usually like one of the loudest unions of a university in Canada. And they have a lot of interdisciplinary programs that kind of, focus on critical race issues. And I mean, it's a great university because I think all those things are needed. But it was my first time being exposed to very radical radicals, and like, some people at that university really were living up to the kind of stereotype of the SJW. Like, I think, well, I mean, I remember the first time that something happened to me. We were in a planning class, and we were reading someone called Jane Jacobs. Maybe you've heard of her. She was like a famous urbanist in New York who fought against like the highways being built in New York because there was going to be freeways built in Manhattan, and she fought a campaign against them. And but she didn't talk about race issues in her books. She wrote a book called like The Life and Death of an American City in like the 60s or 70s. And I remember like there's this classmate who was just like, well, she doesn't talk about race issues, so like, and I was like, yeah, but she makes like good observations. And she was like, yeah, but like, she's not attuned to racism. So like, but I was like, but there's value in what she's saying. And I remember her exact words were, I guess I'm just more radical than you. And I was just like, what the fuck does that even mean? Like, what are you talking about? So, there's a couple of situations where I came across people. And actually, the prison abolition thing was because I took a class that was one of the like most interesting content wise. It was about prison abolition, and it was a seminar. There was probably only like 12 or 13 people in it, but it was like the first time that I was confronted with one of those classes where, like say your name and your preferred gender pronoun. And actually I'd be curious to know what you think about the whole gender pronoun thing, about like putting it in your bio or not. But in any case, like I'm not opposed to that necessarily, but I was just my first time coming across it. And I was just really interested in the arguments about prisons. Like, what good are they doing for society? Are they making society safer? Are they making it better? Are they helping people be their best selves? Or is it the best way of giving people a second chance? Does it rehabilitate? Right? Those questions were front of my mind, those philosophical questions. But I noticed that the class was just so fixated on just talking about how like specifically like communities of color are affected, which is important, but it was just interesting to me that it just took on such a racial lens, which, like I said, is obviously a valuable lens, but it just felt like a missed opportunity, because I always think that the left would do much better if they could frame an argument for like radical prison reform to be like, it's not that this is just going to be better for the people who are disproportionately affected by it, but it's going to be better for everybody, right? Like everybody is going to benefit if we can do something about this. And I feel like there's just such a fixation on like those kinds of like marginalized identities that it loses what I think is a crucial component of the left, which is the common good and like maximizing the common good, I think. So yeah.
I can understand that. I guess I think there seems to be a relevant distinction between, I guess, like deeper theoretical positions on the one hand, and then what rhetoric we think is most useful from the standpoint of political pragmatism on the other hand. And I think that it's certainly true that if we want to be like electorally successful or even just like convincing people, um, it would be a bad idea to frame every issue purely along, this is going to help marginalized communities, because whether or not, I mean, we should absolutely make that argument, but it shouldn't be the only argument, right? Because we also need to appeal to people who might be like white and very self-interested, or, maybe don't even care about like marginalized communities or whatever. And so that being said, I do think that there is, as you said, there is utility in, I guess, talking about things along certain like racial lines. I'm a big advocate, I guess, of what I think is intersectionality. I'm open to somebody telling me I'm using the word wrong or something. But basically, my way of thinking is that there's a bunch of different axes of oppression, right? There's oppression along class lines, along racial lines, along gender lines, etc. And it's really important, like theoretically, to understand how all of these different axes are distinct but like overlapping, right? and kind of see like where they separate, where they overlap.
Yeah,
So
that's
like,
right.
for example, like racial oppression can often overlap with class oppression. Like if you're in a poor Black neighborhood, you might get more oppressed than someone who's, you know, more wealthy and Black. But at the same time, if you're someone who's more wealthy and Black, you might still be more likely to get pulled over by a cop than someone who's more wealthy and white. So I think there's sort of theoretical value to approaching it along that lines, right? Like
Yeah.
focusing on racial oppression sometimes, but also kind of having a more general focus as well to kind of supplement that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, and I think you are using intersectionality correctly. I mean, I think it's just become it's become a boogeyman because,
Mhm.
I mean, the original article by Kimberly Crenshaw was just incredibly reasonable observation about the way the legal system impacts like people with intersecting identities, and like, you know, it's just very I mean, I don't want to say obvious because it was, you know, like a valuable literature at the time, but it's just like there's nothing wrong with that article, like that, like at all. You know, I
Yeah.
don't know if you bothered to read it, but
Mhm.
it's a pretty reasonable article, the original intersectionality one. Um, but yeah, for sure. I mean, so I was curious though, but like, you know, this is where maybe our age difference will be more visible. But like, you know, the preferred gender pronoun, like putting it in your, actually my girlfriend, she's at York, she's doing her PhD at this university I mentioned, and she got an email not long ago from the university saying, you know, when you're on a Zoom call, like please, you should be putting your gender pronouns in your like name, because it encourages all these things. And you know, I mean, it's not that I'm against doing it, but I guess there's just something, and again, this is just me where I'm like, oh, maybe I'm getting old, you know, and it's just like I don't understand. So I don't know, maybe like what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so my understanding of why it's people generally say you should put like pronouns in your bio and stuff is that there's a lot of I guess trans people for whom using the right pronouns for a lot of trans people is like really important, right? Because like one of the main predictors of like trans people's like mental health outcomes is like to what extent people recognize them as the gender that they identify with. And so my understanding is that there's some trans people who really, it's really important that people use the correct pronouns, and they're worried that, you know, people might not, you know, maybe if they're like, they feel that they don't pass or whatever, or
Yeah.
they haven't had like HRT or something. And so it's very important. And so they want to put pronouns in their bio.
Oh, I get
But
that.
at the same time, um, there's this idea that you don't want people to feel like, we don't want to create a situation where if you see pronouns in a bio, you can be like, oh, that person's trans, right? Because trans people also want to be sort of more considered just a part of the gender that they identify with, more so than just like a separate category that people can like identify all the time in a social context. And so the idea is that, you know, if we make it a norm where I guess everybody is putting pronouns in their bios, then trans people feel more comfortable doing that without like being called out or identified immediately as a trans person, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of my understanding of that. Yeah.
I mean, you know, I mean, it totally makes sense. You know, it's just, I think there's something about like like, what's it called? It feels like, I guess I don't like it when there's like certain kinds of, I don't want to say norms of politeness imposed on people, but like, I don't know, there's something, I guess my reaction to it, which is probably some kind of a weird, like, I don't exactly know what the word to use is, but like, yeah, I feel a bit of a sense of resistance where I'm just like, I don't want them to tell me what I should be doing or how I'm presenting myself. It's like,
Right.
you know, talk to me if you want to like get to know about me. But like, you know, the arguments you make are very reasonable. So, you know, perhaps I'll reconsider.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's not like I'm, you know, I don't want to make anyone listening to this or seeing this think that like I'm against it. It's not that I'm against it. It's just like, it's kind of like I just don't really yeah, I don't like the it feels like an imposition sometimes, even though like I'm not philosophically against it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big problem with the left in general is there'll be certain things where I think like it's good to do that. But then like a lot of the times the way these things are kind of like approached by a lot of people is like really problematic. And the way that people approach certain things might turn off a lot of people from otherwise like good ideas, right? Or at least that's sort of like the way
Yeah.
that I think about it.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm kind of doing a bit of self reflection here. And I think part of it too is like, I think if I were to put that in my bio, in my Twitter bio, it would give people the impression that I'm probably also hold a whole other constellation of views, which I don't think that I do, right? I mean, I think both of us are a little bit skeptical of some of the excesses of like, I don't know, whatever you want to call SJW, or I mean, I feel like all these words are insufficient for it, but
Yeah.
the excesses of like the stupid thoughtless left, I guess, just to,
Mm-hmm.
like when that happens. And I feel like having that sometimes can mark you as being like down with all that, maybe. So maybe that's also part of the reason I feel like some mild resistance. It kind it kind of reminds me, and this might be something that's just particular to Canada, but here there's a big push for professors and stuff to kind of start a class with the land acknowledgement. Have you heard about this?
No.
Okay, so so like it's kind of this idea that because like we're on unceded indigenous land,
Mm.
right? So like you start the seminar by saying, I want to acknowledge and say that we're on the land of the like Haudenosaunee. I don't know how to pronounce the different, like whatever the sort of like historical indigenous tribes of the area were, and just to sort of like show solidarity and like acknowledgement that we're on like territory that was not really ceded, that was effectively stolen.
Mm.
And kind of, yeah, I don't know. So you've never heard of that, eh?
No.
So it's a big trend, I think now. It's like some professors do it, some don't. It's certainly not like they're forcing people to do it. But the feeling I get, and I hope I don't get hate about this from people, from listeners or whatever, but sometimes it reminds me a little bit of like it feels a little bit like a prayer or something. Like, and I guess I have a strong sense of like secularity. And of course, all the universities in Canada are public institutions. We don't have any private universities. So it's like it's a public institution, and there's almost I don't know, it feels a little bit like kind of some sort of folk prayer, and it gives me the same feeling as like I remember being somewhere where people are like, okay, before we start this, let's do a little prayer. I don't know.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that that sort of feeling.
Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but that's that's cool. No, I guess it's the first you've heard of it. So
Yeah. Haven't thought much about it.
um so yeah, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot. So yeah, that was really good. If people don't know about you and want to find you, like what debate would you recommend? Like if in your mind, if someone's going to discover Mouthy Infidel, where's the first place that they should look?
Oh, geez, that's a good question. It really just depends on what kind of thing you're interested in. If you're interested in like social issues, I had a debate with on this channel, Politically Provoked, with this guy named Big Papa Fascist that I thought was I guess was received really well. I honestly I judge the quality of my debates based on how they're received, because I don't really watch my stuff very frequently. If you're more interested in like economic stuff, I had a recent debate with the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute and author Yaron Brook, about welfare, which I thought was pretty fun. But yeah, I guess those are the two things that come to mind in terms of like recent debates.
Awesome, and yeah, we will put the link in the description. So that's great. Thanks a lot, Mouthy Infidel.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, cool. I'm going to stop recording here, I guess.